Emma Hartley stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown Chicago office, watching the late September sun cast long shadows across the city. At 45, she had mastered the art of making spaces speak, transforming empty rooms into stories waiting to be lived. Her fingers traced the edge of her latest design sketch, a multi-million-dollar penthouse renovation that would undoubtedly become another jewel in her crown. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Mrs. Hartley, your husband's online too. Something about tonight's reservation?" Emma smiled at her assistant Jenny and reached for the phone. "Daniel, hi, is everything all right? The Morton's reservation is at 7, right?" Daniel's familiar baritone carried a hint of urgency. "The Anderson account is running longer than expected, but I'll make it." "You always do," Emma replied, her tone warm but with an undercurrent of something. Resignation? She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the framed photo on her desk, their 10th anniversary in Tuscany, both of them sun-kissed and laughing. After hanging up, Emma returned to her sketches, but her mind wandered. These Thursday night dates had become their ritual, a constant in their well-ordered life. Their spacious Gold Coast apartment, their successful careers, hers in design, his in investment banking, their comfortable routine of morning runs along Lake Michigan and weekend brunches. It was everything she dreamed of while growing up in suburban Milwaukee. So why did it suddenly feel hollow? Later that afternoon, as Emma walked through a client's newly finished penthouse, her heels clicking against the herringbone floors she'd selected, she felt that familiar surge of pride tinged with something else. The space was perfect, modern yet warm, sophisticated yet inviting, just like her life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Wrapped up early, meet at home first." Emma smiled, gathering her things. This was their rhythm, predictable, harmonious, secure. She'd built her career on understanding how spaces should flow, how elements should complement each other. And somehow, she and Daniel had managed to create that same perfect flow in their marriage. As she headed home that crisp autumn evening, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Like when a room was perfectly staged, but lacked that ineffable quality that made it feel lived in. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the evening ahead. After all, perfection was what she'd always strived for, wasn't it? 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Emma found herself alone in their apartment, the silence broken only by the gentle patter of raindrops against the windows. She'd stayed late at the office, finalizing designs for a major hotel renovation, and now faced the prospect of a solitary dinner, again. As she moved to the kitchen, her eye caught the soft glow emanating from Daniel's home office. He rarely left his computer on. Curiosity piqued, she stepped inside, telling herself she was just being a considerate wife, saving energy. The monitor flickered to life as she brushed the mouse, revealing Daniel's email. A message thread with an unfamiliar address caught her attention. mkenterprises@gmail.com. The subject line read, Alternative arrangements confirmed. Emma's hand hovered over the mouse, her heart suddenly racing. In 15 years of marriage, she'd never snooped through Daniel's emails. Trust was their foundation, wasn't it? But something about the cryptic subject line made her pause. The most recent message was brief. Everything in place. Standard procedure as discussed. Confirmation needed by Friday. Emma's throat constricted. The language was oddly formal. Nothing like Daniel's usual email style. She scrolled down, finding more messages with similar vague references to arrangements and procedures. "This is ridiculous," Emma muttered, closing the browser. Daniel handled sensitive client information. Of course, some correspondence would be discreet. But as she stepped away from the desk, a nagging doubt took root in her mind. That night, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Emma found herself studying her husband's face. Daniel was focused on his pasta, telling her about a new client meeting. "They're particularly interested in our international portfolio," he was saying, but something in his tone seemed different. Or had it always been there, and she was only noticing now? "Any interesting projects?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual while her mind raced with questions. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "The usual. Investment opportunities, portfolio diversification." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing that would interest you, honey." Emma nodded, taking a sip of wine to hide the sudden hurt she felt. When had he started dismissing her interest in his work? She'd always been his sounding board, even if she didn't understand all the financial intricacies. That night, as Daniel slept beside her, Emma lay awake, replaying years of conversations in her mind. Had there been signs she'd missed? Changes so gradual they'd slipped past her designer's eye for detail? She told herself she was being paranoid. Marriages went through phases. People developed separate interests. It was healthy, normal. But as she finally drifted off, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully designed life. Like a perfectly arranged room where someone had moved all the furniture just an inch to the left. Everything looked the same, but something felt irrevocably wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma found herself noticing things she'd previously overlooked. Daniel's late meetings became more frequent, often rescheduled at the last minute. His phone, once casually left on tables or counters, was now always in his pocket, always face down when set aside. During their morning runs along Lake Michigan, Emma observed how he'd fall behind to take calls, his voice lost in the wind and waves. She began timing these calls. 3 minutes, 5 minutes, never longer than 7. Too short for proper business discussions, too regular to be coincidence. One morning, as they stretched near Oak Street Beach, Emma watched Daniel end another of these brief calls. His face had that new expression she'd started cataloging, a mixture of concentration and something else. Worry? Guilt? Everything okay? She asked, adjusting her ponytail and trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Just Jenkins from the London office, Daniel replied too quickly. Time difference, you know. Emma did know about time differences. She also knew it was 4 a.m. in London. That evening, while preparing dinner, she heard Daniel in his office, his voice carrying through their apartment's modern open layout. The transfers need to be untraceable. Yes, I understand the risks. Emma's hand slipped, the knife nicking her finger instead of the carrot she was chopping. As she wrapped a paper towel around the small cut, her mind raced. Untraceable transfers? Risks? The financial world had its own language, she reminded herself, but these words felt heavy with hidden meaning. Later, as they sat in their living room, Emma with her design magazines, Daniel with his laptop, she noticed how he angled the screen away from her. Once, this would have seemed natural. Now it felt deliberate, calculated. I'm thinking of redecorating the office, she said suddenly, watching his reaction. Daniel looked up, his reading glasses catching the light. What's wrong with it? Nothing's wrong, Emma replied carefully, her heart pounding. Sometimes changes help us see things more clearly. He held her gaze for a moment before returning to his screen. If you think it needs it, sure. Emma turned a page in her magazine, not seeing the words. The woman who had built a career on trusting her instincts about spaces was now learning to trust her instincts about something far more important. Something was happening in her perfectly designed life, and for the first time in 15 years, Emma wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. As she glanced at Daniel, hunched over his laptop, she felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. When had they become strangers living in the same beautifully designed space? The breakthrough came on a frost-bitten November morning. Emma had been organizing their home office, ostensibly to plan the renovation, but really to satisfy her growing need to understand. Behind Daniel's filing cabinet, she found a USB drive that had slipped into the gap between the furniture and the wall. Her hands trembled as she plugged it into her laptop. The drive contained dozens of spreadsheets, each labeled with innocuous names like Q3 Marketing and Client Analytics. But as Emma opened them, her interior designer's eye for patterns revealed something disturbing. Hidden within legitimate-looking business transactions were recurring anomalies. Numbers that didn't quite add up. Transfers to shell companies with names that appeared randomly generated. Emma's coffee grew cold beside her as she dug deeper, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Daniel would hear it from the other room. Her years of managing project budgets had given her enough financial acumen to recognize money laundering when she saw it. The amounts were staggering, millions flowing through seemingly legitimate businesses, then disappearing into a maze of offshore accounts. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking in the empty room. "What have you gotten yourself into?" She was still staring at the screen, tears threatening to spill, when her phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." Emma glanced at the time. 10:30 a.m. Her husband was already laying the groundwork for another late night, another set of mysterious transactions. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't new. This had been happening for months, maybe years, right under her nose. She thought about their life together, the comfortable routine, the easy success, the lifestyle they'd built. Had it all been funded by illegal money? Was their entire relationship built on a foundation of lies? With shaking hands, Emma copied the files to her personal drive and returned the USB to its hiding place. Then she did something she'd never done before. She opened her browser and searched for Chicago FBI White-Collar Crime Division. The rest of the day passed in a blur of client meetings and design consultations. Emma maintained her professional facade, but inside, her mind was racing. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped, expecting Daniel to somehow know what she'd discovered. That evening, alone in their apartment, Emma stood at their bedroom window, looking out at the glittering Chicago skyline. The city lights reflected off Lake Michigan, creating patterns that usually soothed her. Tonight, they seemed to mock her with their beauty, reminding her of all the other perfect things in her life that might be illusions. She thought about the woman she'd been just weeks ago, confident, trusting, secure in her marriage and her place in the world. That woman seemed like a stranger now, as distant as the boats moving silently across the dark water below. Emma pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the FBI contact number she'd saved earlier. She had a decision to make, and for the first time in her marriage, she would make it alone. Research became Emma's new obsession. Between client meetings and site visits, she pieced together a complex web of connections. The name MK Enterprises appeared repeatedly, always in conjunction with large international transfers. A quick background check revealed it was registered to a Marcus Kovac, a name that made her blood run cold when she Googled it. Kovac had been investigated multiple times for connections to organized crime, but had never been convicted. His legitimate businesses, construction companies, import-export firms, and real estate developments formed a perfect cover for less legal activities. During dinner one evening, Emma carefully steered the conversation toward Daniel's work. "Tell me about your new clients," she said, watching him over her wine glass. "The international ones?" Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "It's complicated stuff, Em. Mostly foreign investment vehicles, nothing exciting." "Try me," she pressed, noting how his left eye twitched slightly, a tell she'd never noticed before. "I handle million-dollar projects all the time. I understand more than you think." He smiled, but it was tight, controlled. "It's different in finance. Besides, there are confidentiality agreements." That night, Emma lay awake, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside her. She thought about the man she'd married, the kind, ambitious analyst who'd wooed her with homemade dinners and surprise picnics. When had he changed? Or had she just never seen this side of him? Her investigation led her to news articles about recent federal investigations into Chicago's financial sector. Several firms had been implicated in a massive money laundering scheme. None of the articles mentioned Daniel's company, but Emma recognized several of the names from the spreadsheets she'd found. The more she discovered, the more frightened she became, not just of what Daniel might be involved in, but of what knowing about it might mean for her. She began to notice black SUVs parked across from their building, men in suits watching their apartment with too much interest. One afternoon, returning from a client meeting, Emma found her office had been searched. Nothing was obviously disturbed. Whoever had done it was professional. But she knew her space intimately enough to see the subtle signs. Her visitor had been thorough but had found nothing. She'd been careful to keep all her evidence in a secure cloud account. That night, as she watched Daniel check his phone for the 20th time during dinner, Emma realized she needed help. She couldn't handle this alone anymore. But who could she trust when her own husband had become a stranger? The decision to contact law enforcement came after a particularly unsettling incident. Emma was leaving a client's home in Lincoln Park when she noticed a man following her. He was good switching sides of the street, maintaining a natural pace, but her heightened awareness caught every move. Instead of driving home, she headed to the 18th District Police Station, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. As she approached the desk, a female detective caught her eye. The woman was in her early 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Can I help you?" the detective asked, noting Emma's designer outfit and obvious distress. "I need to report." Emma hesitated. What exactly was she reporting? "I need to talk to someone about financial crimes and possibly organized crime connections." The detective's expression didn't change, but she led Emma to a private room. "I'm Detective Laura Bennett, White Collar Division." Over the next hour, Emma carefully laid out what she'd discovered. She watched Bennett's face as she described the transactions, the connections to Kovac, the suspicious patterns she'd noticed. With each detail she shared, Emma felt a mix of relief and terror. There was no going back now. "Mrs. Hartley," Bennett said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "do you realize how dangerous these people are?" Emma's hands clenched in her lap. "I'm beginning to—" "Your husband—" Bennett paused, choosing her words carefully. "We've been investigating several financial institutions with connections to Kovac's organization. Your information could be valuable, but it would put you at risk." "I'm already at risk," Emma replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. "At least this way, I'm doing something about it." Bennett studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need to be careful. Very careful. These people have eyes everywhere, and they won't hesitate to eliminate potential threats." They spent the next hour developing a plan. Emma would continue her normal routine while gathering information. Bennett gave her a secure phone and showed her how to document evidence safely. "Don't tell anyone about this," Bennett warned. "Not your friends, not your family, and especially not your husband. The less people know, the safer you are." As Emma left the station, she felt both terrified and oddly empowered. For weeks she'd been reacting to discoveries, feeling helpless and afraid. Now she had a purpose, a plan, and most importantly, an ally. That evening, as she prepared dinner, maintaining the facade of normal domestic life, Emma thought about the path ahead. She'd built her career on understanding how spaces work together, how different elements could create harmony or discord. Now she was learning about a different kind of space, the shadow world of financial crime, and her role in exposing it. Daniel came home late, as usual, kissing her cheek absently. "Sorry, rough day," he muttered, loosening his tie. Emma smiled, serving dinner with steady hands. "Tell me about it," she said, settling into her role with the precision of a woman who understood that sometimes the most important designs were the ones that nobody could see. Emma's transformation from victim to investigator happened gradually, like the subtle color changes she often used in her design work. Each day, she grew more strategic, more purposeful in her actions. Her design business became the perfect cover for gathering intelligence. She started taking on more projects in buildings connected to Kovac's enterprises, using her professional access to document suspicious activities. Her keen eye for detail, honed over years of interior design work, now served a different purpose. She noticed patterns in visitor logs, irregular maintenance schedules, and unusual security arrangements. During one site visit to a newly renovated office building, Emma deliberately scheduled her appointment when she knew Daniel would be meeting there. From the adjacent floor, she watched through the glass partition as her husband met with Kovac himself, a tall, elegant man whose refined appearance belied his reputation. "The acoustics in this space are problematic," she told the building manager, positioning herself near a vent that carried voices from the conference room below. "We'll need to test different areas." Through her earpiece, connected to Detective Bennett's recording equipment, she caught fragments of conversation about cleaning operations and offshore solutions. Each word felt like another brick in the wall separating her from the man she thought she knew. That evening, as she reviewed fabric swatches in her home office, a cover for organizing her notes, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "You're working late," he said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. Emma held up a textile sample. "The Henderson project is behind schedule. These need to be perfect." She watched him nod and leave, wondering if he felt the same hollow ache she did at how easily they both lied now. Later that night, Emma made a decision. She would no longer be just a passive collector of evidence. She had skills, connections, and most importantly, she had access that law enforcement didn't. It was time to use them. "I want to do more," she told Bennett during their next secure meeting in a busy coffee shop. The detective studied her over her cappuccino. "It's getting dangerous, Emma. Kovac's people are nervous. They know something's happening." "Which is exactly why we need to move faster," Emma insisted, her voice low but intense. "I can help. I know how to make people feel comfortable, How to get them talking. It's what I do every day. Bennett sighed, but Emma saw the glimmer of respect in her eyes. All right, she said finally. But we do this my way, no unnecessary risks. Emma nodded, feeling a surge of determination. She'd spent weeks being afraid. Now it was time to make others nervous. The first warning came in the form of a perfectly arranged bouquet delivered to her office. White lilies, funeral flowers. The card read simply, "Curiosity can be dangerous." Emma photographed it for Bennett before disposing of it, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The surveillance became more obvious. Men in expensive suits lingered near her project sites. Her office phone began having mysterious interference. One morning she found her car's tire slashed, a clean, professional cut. "They're trying to scare you," Bennett said during their secure call. "Maybe it's time to pull back." "No," Emma replied, watching a black SUV cruise past her office for the third time that hour. "That's exactly what they want. Besides, I'm close to something." She was right. Through careful manipulation of her client's schedule and strategic eavesdropping, Emma had discovered that Kovach's organization was planning something big, a major transfer that would happen within the month. But the pressure was mounting. Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He worked later, checked his phone constantly, and Emma caught him having heated whispered conversations in their garage. One night, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. Following the sound of his voice, she crept to his office door. "It has to be handled," he was saying urgently. "We can't afford loose ends. Yes, I understand the cost. Do what needs to be done." Emma retreated silently, her heart pounding. The next morning, over breakfast, she studied her husband's face. The new lines around his mouth, the shadows under his eyes. Was he talking about her last night? Did he know? At work, she maintained her professional facade while carefully documenting everything. Her design presentations now contained hidden recordings of suspicious meetings. Her site visits yielded photographs of questionable transactions. Every detail was meticulously archived and sent to Bennett through their secure channel. But the stakes were rising. During a client meeting in a high-rise downtown, Emma noticed two of Kovach's men in the lobby. They made no attempt to hide their presence, a clear message. That evening, as she worked late in her office, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off while you can." Emma's hands shook as she forwarded the message to Bennett. For the first time since starting this dangerous game, she wondered if she'd gone too far. She was gathering her things to leave when her office door opened. Daniel stood there, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Emma's heart stopped, then resumed at double speed. Had she been discovered? Was this the confrontation she'd been both dreading and hoping for? "Of course," she replied, proud of how normal her voice sounded. "Just let me finish up here." As she followed her husband out of the office, Emma sent a prearranged signal to Bennett. Whatever was about to happen, she wouldn't face it alone. The drive home was silent, heavy with unspoken words. Emma watched Daniel's hands grip the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. They weren't heading to their apartment. "Where are we going?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Somewhere we can talk privately," Daniel replied, turning onto Lakeshore Drive. They ended up at Monroe Harbor, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. Daniel parked facing the lake, killed the engine, and for several long moments, just sat there. "How much do you know?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma turned to face him, her heart pounding but her mind clear. "Enough to be afraid," she answered honestly. "Both for you and of you." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "I never wanted you involved in this. I tried so hard to keep you safe. By lying to me? By getting involved with criminals?" Emma's voice cracked with emotion. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It started small, just helping some clients move money offshore. Then Kovach got involved and suddenly..." He trailed off, looking lost. "Why didn't you come to me?" Emma asked, fighting back tears. "We could have faced it together." "Because I was ashamed," Daniel whispered. "And then it was too late. They had too much on me. I became valuable to them, my connections, my client list." As Daniel talked, Emma's trained eye for detail caught movement in her side mirror, a car parking behind them, then another. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Bennett's signal. "Daniel," she said carefully, "did you tell them about tonight?" His eyes met hers, filled with anguish. "They made me. They said they'd hurt you if I didn't help them find out what you knew." Emma reached for his hand, feeling a complex mix of emotions, anger, fear, but also a deep, residual love. "It's not too late to fix this, but you have to trust me right now." The harbor parking lot suddenly blazed with light as FBI vehicles emerged from hidden positions. Detective Bennett's voice came over a loudspeaker. "This area is surrounded. Stay in your vehicle." Daniel stared at his wife in shock. I couldn't save our marriage," Emma said softly, squeezing his hand. "But I can still save you, if you let me." As FBI agents approached their car, Emma felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had spent months uncovering deception. Now it was time for truth, whatever the cost. The next 48 hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated design installation, with every element falling precisely into place. From the safety of an FBI safe house, a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, Emma watched her months of careful evidence gathering bear fruit. Daniel, facing the reality of his situation, chose cooperation. His knowledge of Kovach's operation, combined with Emma's meticulously gathered evidence, provided the FBI with what they needed to move forward. But it had to be handled delicately. "Kovach's organization has people everywhere," Bennett explained, spreading files across the safe house dining table. "We need to move fast but smart. One wrong step and the whole operation could collapse." Emma studied the photographs and documents before her, familiar faces and places now cast in a sinister new light. "What do you need me to do?" "Something risky," Bennett admitted. "We need you to continue being the oblivious wife. Daniel will return home, apparently having convinced you that his late nights were about a legitimate new project. Meanwhile, you'll help us set up our final move." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Emma would host a charity event for her design firm's anniversary, something she'd been planning anyway. The guest list would include many of Chicago's elite, including Kovach and his associates. The venue, a historic building downtown, would be wired for surveillance, allowing the FBI to gather final evidence of the organization's activities. "They'll be suspicious," Emma pointed out, her designer's instinct for potential flaws kicking in. "They're already suspicious," Bennett countered. "But they're also arrogant. They don't believe a designer could be a threat." Emma thought about all the times she'd been underestimated in her career, how often people had dismissed her profession as mere decoration. For once, those prejudices would work in her favor. The next day, Emma returned home, playing the role of a relieved wife who'd accepted her husband's explanations. Daniel, coached by the FBI, maintained his normal routine while feeding carefully selected information to Kovach's organization. As Emma worked on the charity event plans, she felt a strange calm. Her design experience had taught her that the most successful projects required both vision and precision. This was no different, just with much higher stakes. She selected the venue carefully, an Art Deco masterpiece with excellent sightlines for surveillance. Every detail was considered, from the placement of tables to the timing of service staff. What looked like elegant party planning to outsiders was actually a carefully choreographed trap. "You're remarkable," Daniel told her one evening as she reviewed seating arrangements. "I never saw it before. How strategic you are." Emma looked up at him, seeing both the man she'd married and the stranger he'd become. "You never really looked," she replied softly. As the event date approached, Emma felt the tension building. She'd designed hundreds of spaces throughout her career, but this would be her masterpiece, a design not of rooms and furnishings, but of justice and redemption. The night of the charity event arrived on a crisp December evening. The historic venue glowed with warmth, its Art Deco details enhanced by Emma's careful lighting design. Every corner, every shadow, had been considered and accounted for. Guests arrived in waves, Chicago's wealthy and powerful, dressed in their finest. Emma played the perfect hostess, greeting each arrival with practiced charm while noting their positions on her mental floor plan. Bennett's team monitored everything from a command center in the building's basement. Kovach arrived fashionably late, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, taking her hand. "Your reputation for creating beautiful spaces is well deserved." "You're too kind," Emma replied, suppressing a shudder at his touch. "Please, enjoy the evening." The event proceeded according to plan. During dinner, Emma watched as Kovach's associates moved through the crowd, conducting business under the guise of social interaction. Her hidden cameras caught every handshake, every whispered conversation. The crucial moment came during the auction portion of the evening. As planned, Daniel approached Kovach with urgent news about their latest operation. They moved to a private room, one Emma had specially prepared with surveillance equipment. Emma circulated among the guests, maintaining her role while listening through her concealed earpiece. In the private room, Daniel was doing his part, drawing out specific details about money laundering operations and corrupt officials. Suddenly something shifted. Through her earpiece, Emma heard Kovach's tone change. "You think I don't know about your wife's activities?" he said coldly. Emma's heart stopped. This wasn't part of the plan. "Your clumsy attempts at investigation," Kovach continued. "Your wife's convenient appearances at my properties. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Emma was moving before she consciously decided to, her designer's knowledge of the building's layout guiding her feet. She reached the private room just as she heard the sound of a scuffle. She opened the door to find Daniel backed against the wall, Kovach's hand at his throat. Two of Kovach's men blocked the exit. "Mrs. Hartley," Kovach said without turning. "How nice of you to join us." "Let him go," Emma said, her voice steady despite her fear. Kovach laughed. "Or what? You'll redecorate me to death?" "No," Emma replied, pressing a hidden button on her bracelet, the signal Bennett had given her for emergencies. "But they might have something to say about it." The room erupted in action. FBI agents emerged from hidden panels Emma had designed into the walls. More burst through the door behind her. In seconds, Kovach and his men were surrounded. As Bennett read Kovach his rights, Emma rushed to Daniel, who was catching his breath against the wall. "Are you okay?" she asked, checking him for injuries. "I am now," he replied, looking at her with new respect. "You really did think of everything." Emma watched as Kovach was led away in handcuffs, his carefully maintained dignity finally cracking. "That's what designers do," she said softly. "We think about every detail." In the weeks following the charity event, Emma watched her carefully designed life dismantle and rebuild itself in unexpected ways. The FBI's operation had netted not just Kovach, but dozens of his associates and corrupt officials. Daniel, in exchange for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence, 3 years in a minimum security facility. Standing in their apartment, now feeling too large for one person, Emma began the process of packing Daniel's things. Each object held memories: the leather briefcase she'd given him for their 10th anniversary, the collection of ties arranged by color, her influence, the framed photo from their first vacation together. "You don't have to do this alone," Bennett said, stopping by to check on her. The detective had become more than just an ally during their months of collaboration. "I know," Emma replied, carefully wrapping a crystal paperweight. "But I need to. It's part of the process." She'd visited Daniel at the detention center the day before. They'd talked for hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time in years, about his initial involvement with Kovach, about her investigation, about the future. "I didn't just fail the law," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed us, failed you. We both failed," Emma had responded. "We stopped seeing each other, really seeing each other, long before Kovach entered the picture." Now, as she moved through their shared space, Emma recognized how the design of their marriage had failed. Too much emphasis on appearance, not enough on foundation. As with any flawed design, the solution wasn't to patch over the problems, but to start fresh. She threw herself into her work, but differently now. Her designs became more daring, more authentic. Clients commented on the new energy in her presentations. "There's something deeper in your work now," one told her. "Like you're not just designing spaces, but experiences." The media attention gradually faded. The designer who brought down Chicago's biggest financial criminal became yesterday's news. Emma preferred it that way. She had learned that the most powerful changes often happened quietly, in the spaces between the dramatic moments. One evening, as she sat in her redesigned home office, now warmer, more open, with a view of the lake she'd previously ignored, Emma found herself sketching plans for a new project, a community center for families of incarcerated individuals. She'd seen firsthand how isolation could corrupt both those inside and outside prison walls. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bennett. Kovac took the plea deal. It's really over. Emma looked out at the Chicago skyline, the lights reflecting off the lake just as they had the night she'd discovered Daniel's emails. The view was the same, but she saw it differently now. Like any well-designed space, her life had required both demolition and reconstruction to become something stronger, more authentic, and ultimately more beautiful. 6 months later, Emma stood in the newly opened community center, watching families connect in the spaces she'd designed for healing and hope. The building incorporated elements of transparency, lots of glass and open spaces, while still providing the privacy and security its users needed. Daniel called weekly from prison, their conversations more honest than they'd been in years. He'd started teaching financial literacy to fellow inmates, finding purpose in helping others avoid the paths he'd taken. Emma's design firm had evolved too. She'd started a program offering internships to former inmates interested in construction and design, believing in the power of creation to transform lives. "You've created something remarkable here," Bennett said, joining her at the center's opening ceremony. "We all did," Emma replied, watching a young girl show her incarcerated father her art project through one of the center's video chat stations. Sometimes the best designs come from the deepest breaks. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows through the center's windows, Emma reflected on her journey. She'd learned that true design wasn't just about making spaces beautiful. It was about making them honest, functional, and healing. Like her own life, it required constant adjustment, attention to detail, and the courage to tear down what wasn't working to build something better. What did you think of Emma's attitude? Would you do the same? Leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos to surprise you. Like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.